For 30 years, Desmond Lofton has been the man everyone in his family and community calls when something breaks, reliable, generous, and never once asking for anything back. This video traces what happens when a black Gen X man built almost entirely around usefulness starts to notice the quiet cost of never putting himself first, and traces the inherited grief that turns out to be the real root of that habit. It follows him toward a small, hard-won permission, the right to want something purely for himself. Desmond Lofton has been standing in the same 6 feet of floor space for 11 minutes. The saxophone is sitting on the counter in front of him, brass catching the afternoon light coming through the shop window. Gordon has stopped pretending to dust the shelves nearby because he already knows how this goes. 3 Saturdays in a row now, Desmond drives over to the little repair shop near 18th and Vine, picks the horn up, turns it over like he's checking it for damage, and sets it back down. "You gonna marry that thing or buy it?" Gordon finally says, not looking up from his ledger. Desmond laughs, closes the velvet-lined case, and says the same thing he said the last 2 times. "Let me think on it a little more." Gordon has known Desmond since they were teenagers bagging groceries together at a store that closed before either of them turned 30, and he's watched this exact routine play out with other things over the years. A motorcycle, a set of golf clubs, a used pickup with a camper shell. Desmond always finds a reason the money should go somewhere else, and Gordon has stopped arguing about it, because arguing has never once worked. He is 58 years old. He has the exact price of that horn sitting untouched in a savings account, and he still cannot make himself hand over a card for something that would only benefit him. That one hesitation is the whole story of Desmond Lofton, if you know how to read it. For 30 years, people in his life have called him a version of the same name. His crew calls him Chief. His softball league calls him Coach. His sister-in-law calls him the guy who fixes it, usually right before she calls him about something that's broken. Nobody in Desmond's world has ever had to wonder whether he'll show up. What almost nobody in his world has ever asked is whether Desmond is doing all right underneath all that showing up. He would tell you he's fine because "I'm good" is the closest thing he has to a personal motto. Here's the contradiction sitting at the center of this man. Desmond Lofton will spend 4 hours on a Sunday rewiring his cousin's garage for free, then walk past a $50 fishing rod in a store window and tell himself it isn't practical. He gives without blinking and receives like it's a foreign language he never got around to learning. Ask him why, and he doesn't have a fast answer, because the reasons live somewhere underneath the part of his brain that talks. You can see the pattern if you just watch how he moves through an ordinary Tuesday. He answers every text within 90 seconds, even the ones that aren't emergencies, because a slow reply from Desmond makes people worry something's wrong. When a bill comes in the mail, he pays whoever else's name is on it before he pays his own, like there's an invisible line, and everyone else's needs get to stand in front of his. If the dishwasher breaks, he fixes it himself at 11 at night rather than calling someone, even though fixing things for strangers all day is literally how he makes his living. When his blood pressure cuff started beeping funny numbers a few months back, his first thought wasn't about his own heart. It was about who would run his crew if he had to slow down. He keeps an unopened box of golf clubs in his garage, a gift to himself he bought 2 years ago and never once took out of the plastic. Next to it sits a half-finished model train set from his own childhood, still in pieces, still waiting for a version of Desmond who has time that belongs only to him. Ask him what music he plays when he's completely alone in the truck, and he'll admit, almost sheepishly, that it's old jazz records his father used to spin on Sunday mornings. He never mentions that out loud to anybody, because somewhere along the way he decided that his own preferences were a kind of luxury item, not something to advertise. His newest apprentice, a 24-year-old named Tyrell, asked him once why he still drives out to every emergency call himself instead of just dispatching it. Desmond gave him the practical answer, something about liability and training, and Tyrell nodded like that settled it. What Desmond didn't say is that a tripped breaker at midnight is easier for him to sit with than an empty evening with nothing on the calendar. His crew has started a running joke that Desmond's idea of a vacation is a job site 2 counties over, and he laughs along with it every time, mostly because it's true, and partly because the joke lets him avoid the question underneath it. His over 40 softball league has a similar joke, since Desmond is the only man on the roster who shows up to games with a truck full of tools in case somebody's dugout bench needs fixing. His teammates call him Home Depot half affectionately, and he wears it like an honor instead of what it actually is, which is a man who cannot sit in the stands for 2 hours without finding something useful to do with his hands. People read his constant availability as dedication, sometimes as a kind of quiet strength, rarely as what it actually is, which is a man who has never learned what stillness is supposed to feel like without dread showing up right behind it. To understand why a grown man treats his own wants like contraband, you have to go back to a Kansas City that doesn't exist anymore. Desmond was born in 1968, on the Missouri side, in a neighborhood not far from the old stockyards in the West Bottoms. His father, Cornelius Lofton, worked those stockyards as a young man before they started winding down through the 70s, and finally closed for good by the early 90s. Cornelius saw the writing on the wall early and apprenticed into the electricians' union, a decision that kept steady work coming into the Lofton household long after a lot of his stockyard coworkers were scrambling. On weekends, though, Cornelius had a second life nobody at the Union Hall knew much about. He played alto saxophone in a loose little combo that worked church socials, wedding receptions, and the occasional Friday set near 18th and Vine, a neighborhood that had been the beating heart of Kansas City, just a generation before Desmond was born. By the time Cornelius was gigging there in the 70s, the district was well past its golden years, its old clubs boarded up or converted. Decades before the city would eventually invest in restoring the area around a jazz museum, built to honor exactly the sound Cornelius used to chase on weekends. Desmond's mother, Odessa, worked switchboard shifts for the phone company back then, and Sunday mornings in that house had a specific rhythm. Odessa cooking, Cornelius on the back porch with the horn, and 2 boys pretending not to care while absolutely listening through the screen door. Desmond's earliest memory of his father isn't the electrician in coveralls. It's a man with his eyes closed, horn tilted toward the ceiling, completely somewhere else for 4 minutes at a time. That version of Cornelius disappeared when Desmond was 15, and it never fully came back. Desmond had an older brother, Cornelius Jr. Everybody called CJ, 2 years ahead of him and by all accounts the golden one. CJ was funnier, looser, better at basketball, the kind of teenager who could talk his way out of trouble and often did. He was also, quietly, using more than anyone in the family understood, at a moment in the early 80s when heroin was moving through pockets of Kansas City with very little warning attached to it. CJ died 3 weeks after his 17th birthday in a friend's basement, of an overdose nobody saw coming until it had already happened. Desmond found out at school, called down to the office over the intercom, and the walk from that classroom to the front doors is a hallway he still sometimes sees in his sleep. What happened inside the Lofton house after that funeral is a pattern family therapists have seen in a lot of households that survive a sudden loss. When a family is flattened by grief, one child often steps forward, consciously or not, to become proof that the household still works. That child learns to need nothing, ask for nothing, and cause no additional worry, because the family's capacity for handling anything else has already been used up. 15-year-old Desmond became that child almost overnight, and nobody, including Desmond, ever formally decided it. He started making his own bed without being asked, brought his report cards in already signed by himself in his mother's looping handwriting until she caught him, and told his parents he was fined so often that eventually they believed him and stopped checking. Cornelius, for his part, boxed up the saxophone the week of the funeral and never played it in front of his family again. Odessa, Desmond's mother, later said the last time she heard her husband play was standing outside a bedroom door, quietly, alone, thinking nobody could hear him. A grieving household doesn't usually announce its new rules out loud, but the rule in the Lofton house became clear anyway. You keep moving, you don't indulge, you don't stop long enough to feel what's underneath. Desmond absorbed that rule so completely that by the time he was in his 20s, wanting something purely for his own pleasure had started to feel, in his body, dangerous. Move forward almost 40 years, and that 15-year-old is running Lofton Electric, a company he built from a one-man truck into 14 employees doing residential and commercial work across the metro. His wife, Renata, a school administrator with a much easier relationship to rest than her husband, has spent 2 decades gently pointing out that Desmond treats his own exhaustion like a rumor rather than a fact. She's the one who finally got him to see a doctor about the headaches he'd been calling just a long week for the better part of a year. The doctor used a phrase Desmond didn't love: borderline hypertension, common in men his age, worth watching closely. "Anything stressful going on at home?" the doctor asked, glancing up from the chart. Desmond said no, nothing out of the ordinary, and meant it, because 30 years of carrying everyone else's weight had started to feel to him like the ordinary. The doctor wrote him a prescription and a note to check back in 3 months, and Desmond folded both into his glove compartment and forgot about them by the time he hit the highway. Researchers actually have a name for the coping style Desmond has been running his whole adult life on, and it isn't flattering once you understand what it costs the body. Psychologist Sherman James, studying health outcomes among Black Americans, identified a pattern he called John Henryism, named after the folk hero who worked himself to death trying to outwork a machine. It describes a high-effort, relentless style of coping with pressure and limited resources, one that can look like strength from the outside while quietly raising blood pressure and wearing down the cardiovascular system from the inside. James's research and the studies that followed it found this pattern most costly precisely for people who are working the hardest with the least outside support, which describes a lot of men who came up the way Desmond did. National health data has consistently shown Black men living with one of the shortest average life expectancies of any group in the country, years behind their white counterparts, a gap that widened sharply during the pandemic and has only partly closed back since. That number stops being abstract the moment you picture it sitting across the dinner table from Desmond, a man who has quietly outworked every stressor life handed him, whose body has been keeping a private tab this entire time. His crew sees a boss who never raises his voice and never seems rattled. What they don't see is a man answering a 2 a.m. emergency call for a client's tripped breaker instead of letting his on-call technician handle it, because somewhere in Desmond's wiring, being needed still feels safer than being at rest. A few weeks before the saxophone started haunting him, Desmond's son Malik called from Denver with an idea for his father's 59th birthday. Malik wanted to fly him out to Table Rock Lake for a weekend of nothing but fishing. No phone reception, no crew calling, just father and son on a boat for 2 days. He'd already looked up a cabin, already priced out a guide, already picked a weekend that worked around Desmond's schedule instead of asking Desmond to rearrange anything. Desmond said yes on the phone, sounded genuinely moved, told Malik it was the best idea he'd heard all year, and meant every word of it in the moment. Then he quietly called his mother's assisted living facility the next morning to ask about covering an unexpected increase in her monthly rate. He redirected the money Malik had offered toward that bill without telling either his son or his mother what he'd done. Nobody asked him to make that trade. He made it because somewhere inside him, spending money purely on his own enjoyment while anybody else in the family had an unmet need still registered as a kind of theft. This is where a stereotype and the actual research start to pull apart from each other in an interesting way. The popular image of the hyper-responsible black provider often gets flattened into either a compliment or a complaint, strong and stoic on one side, emotionally unavailable on the other. What gets left out of both versions is the amount of quiet vigilance underneath the behavior, the part where a man is scanning every room for who might be struggling before he ever asks himself the same question. The American Psychological Association's own guidelines on working with men and boys point to something similar on a broader scale, noting that traditional masculine norms discourage emotional expression and help-seeking in ways that carry real costs to mental and physical health. National survey data backs that up in a more specific way. Black adults consistently seek out mental health treatment at lower rates than white adults, even when researchers control for how much distress they're actually reporting. Desmond has never once sat in a therapist's office, and if you asked him why, he'd probably shrug and say he's never had the time, which is true and also isn't really the whole answer. For a man like Desmond, that general pattern gets layered on top of something more specific and more personal. A 15-year-old boy's private theory that stillness is what took his brother. That theory was never spoken, never tested, and never true in any factual sense, and it has still been running Desmond's decisions for 4 decades. Here's the deeper reveal underneath everything else in this story, the piece that reframes both the giving and the refusal to rest as 2 branches of the exact same root. Desmond didn't just decide to be generous after CJ died. He decided, without ever putting words to it, that needing something for himself was the first step down a road that ends the way his brother's road ended. CJ wanted an escape, wanted relief, wanted a feeling that belonged only to him, and that want, in 15-year-old Desmond's understanding of the world, is what killed him. So Desmond built a life almost entirely without private wanting, because private wanting had become, in his internal logic, the most dangerous thing a man in his family could do. His hyper-reliability wasn't only love, though it was absolutely also love. It was also armor, built by a teenager trying to make sure his family never had to bury a second son. Every emergency call answered, every bill paid ahead of his own, every want quietly swapped out for someone else's need, was Desmond casting a small vote against the possibility of ever standing in that hallway again. He never once thought of it in those terms while he was doing it, because that's how a protective belief formed at 15 usually works. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly writes the rules and lets the adult live inside them. That's the strength side of this pattern, and it's real. Desmond's refusal to need anything held his household together during a period when it could easily have come apart. The cost side is just as real, and it's been accumulating quietly for 40 years in his blood pressure, his friendships, and the parts of himself he stopped introducing to anyone, including his own wife. Renata will tell you, if you ask her privately, that she sometimes misses the version of Desmond who used to talk about wanting things before wanting things started to scare him. Old friends have mostly drifted, not from any falling out, but from decades of Desmond being too booked helping everyone else to make time for anything that existed purely for pleasure. His daughter Ayanna called him last month in the middle of planning her wedding, spent 20 minutes venting about a florist who doubled her quote, and then tacked on a rushed, "You good, Dad?" right before hanging up, not really waiting for the answer. "I'm good, baby," he said, to a line that had already gone quiet on the other end. Nobody in Desmond's family is unkind or thoughtless. They've simply learned from 30 years of watching him that Desmond doesn't need checking on, because Desmond taught them that lesson every single day without meaning to. There's a structural piece of this story too, separate from Desmond's personal history, and it matters because it shows he isn't imagining the pressure. Pew Research Center has found that adults in their 40s are more likely than any other age group to be caught in what researchers call the sandwich generation, simultaneously supporting a living parent and their own children. And that Generation X specifically sits at the center of that squeeze right now. More than half of people in their 40s fall into that category, financially and logistically responsible in two directions at once, which is a very unglamorous way of saying that Desmond's exhaustion has company he's never met. In practice, for Desmond, that means a spreadsheet on his laptop tracking his mother's copies in one tab and Ayanna's wedding contributions in another, updated on Sunday nights after everyone else has gone to bed. On top of that squeeze, Federal Reserve data on Gen X finances has found that a large share of households in Desmond's generation have little to nothing saved for retirement, a byproduct of entering the workforce right as pensions disappeared and 401k plans became the whole plan. Desmond isn't failing at some test other men are quietly passing. He is living out a structural collision between generational bad timing and a personal history that taught him rest equals danger, and almost nobody around him has ever said that combination out loud. The turning point in this story didn't come from a doctor's warning or a wife's patient nudging, though both had been chipping away at him for years. It came from his mother, Odessa, 81 years old, sharp as ever, sitting across from him during a Sunday visit at Blue Ridge Manor. Desmond had mentioned the saxophone almost as a throwaway line, embarrassed even bringing it up, and Odessa's face changed in a way he hadn't seen in years. She told him something he had never known, something Cornelius apparently never told either of his sons directly. His father hadn't quietly faded out of music because 30-year-old men with 2 kids and a mortgage just naturally stopped playing. He boxed up that saxophone the week of CJ's funeral and physically could not open the case again, not because he stopped loving it, but because he associated it permanently with the last ordinary Sunday before everything broke. Odessa had heard him once, standing outside their bedroom door months later, playing quietly to himself, and then never again after that single night. He never replaced that private joy with anything, she said. He just filled the space where it used to live with more work, more responsibility, more proof that he was still standing. Desmond sat with that for a long moment, because he realized, sitting in his mother's small apartment, that he had spent 40 years unconsciously finishing his father's sentence. Cornelius buried his joy the week his son died and never dug it back up, and Desmond, without ever being told the details, built an entire adult life on the same unspoken rule. That's the moment this story stops being only about one man's stubbornness and becomes about something passed quietly between 2 generations, neither of whom meant to hand it down. 2 behaviors that looked completely unrelated on the surface: a father's disappearing hobby and a son's refusal to buy himself a saxophone 40 years later, turned out to share a single root system underground the whole time. Desmond drove straight from his mother's apartment to Gordon's shop before he could talk himself out of it again. Gordon looked up from the ledger, already halfway into his usual joke, and stopped when he saw Desmond's face. Desmond didn't say much, just set his card on the counter and asked Gordon to wrap the case up. He didn't buy it because he suddenly believed he deserved nice things, and he'll tell you that part honestly if you ask him. He bought it because he finally understood what the hesitation had actually been protecting him from feeling, and once he saw it clearly, he couldn't unsee it. None of this turned Desmond into a different man overnight, and the story would be dishonest if it pretended otherwise. He still answers work calls faster than he should, still catches himself halfway through redirecting money that was meant to be his, still has to consciously stop and ask whether a request is actually his to carry. What's different now is smaller and steadier than a transformation. He blocks one evening a week, no exceptions, no emergencies unless something is actually on fire. He told Renata about the sax before he told anyone else, and watched something loosen in her shoulders that had been tight for longer than he'd noticed. He started answering some requests with, "Let me get back to you," a sentence that used to feel impossible, and now just feels like a normal thing a normal person says. The guilt still shows up sometimes, uninvited, usually late at night, and instead of buying it off with another sacrifice, he's learning to just let it sit there until it passes on its own. The saxophone lives in his garage now, next to the model train that's still in pieces and the golf club still half in plastic, except this case gets opened. Some evenings, it's 15 minutes of scales that sound rough and unfamiliar in his hands, nothing close to the sound his father used to pull out of that same instrument. Other evenings he just sits with the case open, not even playing, letting himself want something without immediately explaining why it's justified. Gordon still texts him about it now and then, half joking, asking if he's marrying that horn after all, and Desmond usually just sends back a photo of it sitting out on the workbench instead of packed away. Go back to the beginning of this story, to a man standing in a repair shop for the fourth Saturday in a row, and you can now hear what that hesitation was actually saying. It wasn't about money, and it was never really about the horn. It was a 15-year-old boy's old promise, still running quietly underneath a 58-year-old man's decisions, insisting that wanting things was how you lost people. Desmond Lofton spent 30 years being everyone's proof that the family still worked, and it took his mother's one honest sentence to show him that proof and joy were never supposed to be opposites in the first place. Renata says she noticed the change less in anything he said and more in how he sits now, shoulders down instead of braced, on the nights he lets himself do nothing in particular. Odessa never asked him what he did with the truth she handed him that Sunday, and Desmond never explained it to her either, because some conversations do their work quietly and don't need a second round. He's still the guy everyone calls when something breaks. He's just finally started answering his own calls too. If you know a man like Desmond, the kind who fixes everything except the part of himself that never learned how to rest, the next video in this series looks at what happens when his wife decides she's done waiting for permission to matter too.